1542. A starving Spanish crew drifts down an unmapped river, half dead, out of food, expecting to die in the jungle any day. Instead, for mile after mile, the riverbank fills with people, towns, raised roads, terraced fields, crowds gathering to watch them pass. The expedition's chronicler writes it all down. When the survivors finally make it back to Spain and tell the story, almost nobody believes them. This year, nearly 500 years later, a new study using airborne lasers identified more than 20,000 hidden structures buried under the Amazon rainforest canopy, and modeling suggests tens of thousands more are still out there, unseen. It turns out the starving Spaniard wasn't exaggerating. Before we go further, hit subscribe. This is the story of an eyewitness account that got buried by its own impossibility, a scientific theory that convinced the world the Amazon was always empty, and the technology that just proved both of them wrong. 1. The man nobody believed. In February 1541, a Spanish expedition under Gonzalo Pizarro set out from Quito in search of cinnamon and gold. It went badly almost immediately. Starvation, hostile terrain, a supply party sent ahead that never came back. That supply party was led by a lieutenant named Francisco de Orellana, and instead of returning upstream against a punishing current, he and his crew kept going, becoming the first Europeans to travel the entire length of the Amazon River, from the Andes to the Atlantic. Along the way, the expedition's Dominican friar, Gaspar de Carvajal, kept a written account. He described riverside settlements stretching for what looked like miles, roads running back from the water, organized agriculture, and dense populations who came out in canoes and on the banks to meet them. Not scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, but something that looked, by his account, like a functioning civilization. He also described fierce women warriors fighting alongside the men, which is where the river got its name. Carvajal wasn't vague about it either. He described walled towns, painted pottery, granaries stocked with food, and roads wide enough to be seen clearly from the water, the kind of infrastructure that doesn't spring up overnight and doesn't belong to a handful of wandering families. He wrote about villages so close together that the expedition sometimes couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. For centuries, almost nobody took him seriously. Later, expeditions came back to those same stretches of river and found thin jungle, small scattered villages, and nothing resembling the crowded landscape he'd described. The natural conclusion, repeated by historians for generations, was that Carvajal had exaggerated or invented details to justify a disastrous, pointless expedition. By the 20th century, the scientific consensus had hardened into something closer to doctrine. It was never just one soldier's tall tale. It was a 500-year-old eyewitness account that the rest of history quietly decided to stop believing. 2. The theory that buried the evidence. In 1971, American anthropologist Betty Meggers published a book that would define how scientists thought about the Amazon for the next 50 years. Amazonia, Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise. Her argument was straightforward and, at the time, persuasive. Amazonian soil is famously poor, thin, acidic, quickly stripped of nutrients once the forest cover is cleared. Meggers argued that this kind of environment could never have supported large, dense, permanently settled populations. Whatever Orellana and Carvajal thought they saw, in her view, could not have been a real, complex society. It became known as the counterfeit paradise theory, and for decades it was the default explanation in textbooks. Lush jungle on the surface, but ecologically incapable of building cities underneath it. The theory had a convenient side effect. It meant nobody needed to go looking for what wasn't supposed to be there. Any scattered earthwork or unusual mound a researcher stumbled across could be treated as a curiosity rather than a clue. The Amazon got filed away as humanity's last great untouched wilderness, a place people had passed through, but never really built. It was never just a scientific theory. It was a reason not to look, dressed up as a conclusion. 3. The forest gives itself away. The first real cracks in that theory didn't come from archaeologists. They came from cattle ranchers. Starting in the 1990s, as ranchers in the Brazilian state of Acre cleared sections of forest, geometric shapes started appearing in the newly bare earth. Squares, circles, and hexagons cut in shallow ditches, some of them hundreds of meters across, connected to each other by straight roads. From the ground, they looked like nothing. From above, they were unmistakably engineered. These became known as the Acre Geoglyphs, and there are now more than 400 of them documented, dated to roughly 2,000 years old. Around the same time, researchers working in the Xingu region of Brazil, studying communities descended from the ancient Quichuro people, began mapping something even harder to dismiss. Clusters of large planned towns connected by wide engineered roads running arrow straight for kilometers, surrounded by moats and defensive ditches, arranged in a regional pattern with a level of urban planning nobody had expected to find under rainforest canopy. Some of these road-connected clusters are estimated to have supported populations in the tens of thousands. It wasn't one city. It was a network of them, deliberately laid out the way a modern planner might sketch a cluster of connected suburbs. But every one of these discoveries depended on the forest already being cut down or thin enough to see through. The vast majority of the Amazon basin, an area roughly the size of the contiguous United States, was still, quite literally, invisible. Archaeologists could walk transects, dig test pits, and interview ranchers for decades, and still only ever sample a tiny fraction of what was under the canopy. It was never just a lack of curiosity. It was a landscape actively hiding its own history under 50 feet of living green. 4. Seeing through the trees. The tool that finally cracked the problem open is called LiDAR, light detection and ranging. An aircraft or drone flies over the forest firing thousands of laser pulses a second, straight down through the canopy. Most of those pulses bounce off leaves and branches, but a small percentage slip through the gaps in the foliage and hit the actual ground, then bounce back up to the sensor. Software then throws away every pulse that hit vegetation and keeps only the ones that reached bare earth, building what's called a bare earth digital elevation model, essentially an X-ray of the ground with the entire forest digitally erased. The results, when researchers started running this technology at scale across the southwestern Amazon, were staggering. In 2022, a team led by archaeologist Heiko Prumers used LiDAR over Bolivia's Llanos de Mojos region and found the remains of the Casarabi culture. Stepped earthen pyramids up to 22 meters tall, plazas, water reservoirs, and causeways connecting settlements across dozens of kilometers, forming what researchers described as a genuine, low-density urban civilization, built and occupied roughly 1,500 years ago. It was never just a mapping tool. It was the first time in 500 years anyone had actually been able to see what Carvajal saw. 5. The number that changed the map. This year's study took that same approach and scaled it up dramatically, combining airborne and satellite LiDAR data across a much larger stretch of the southwestern Amazon. The result? More than 20,000 individual pre-Columbian earthworks identified in the surveyed area alone, geometric geoglyphs, residential mounds, raised agricultural fields, canals, and causeways connecting settlements the way highways connect modern cities. And that number is almost certainly a floor, not a ceiling. The area covered by this survey is only a sliver of the full Amazon basin. which sprawls across roughly 2.5 million square miles of South America, most of which has never been scanned this way at all. The researchers behind the study used statistical modeling to estimate how many more sites are likely sitting undetected in the huge stretches of forest that remain unsurveyed, and the projections run into the tens of thousands. Population estimates for the pre-Columbian Amazon, once dismissed at under 1 million scattered people, are now being seriously discussed in the millions. Some researchers argue as many as 8 to 10 million people once lived across the basin, organized into networks of towns and cities connected by engineered roads, canals, and agricultural terraces. Think about what that actually means. Every one of those 20,000 plus earthworks was invisible from a satellite photo, invisible from an airplane window, and invisible to anyone standing on the forest floor a few dozen meters away from it. An entire civilization's infrastructure was sitting there the whole time, at a scale that rivals some of the better-known urban cultures of the ancient world, and it took lasers to finally admit it was real. That is, almost point for point, the picture Gaspar de Carvajal wrote down in 1542 and got laughed at for describing. It was never just 20,000 data points on a map. It was proof, finally, that the version of the Amazon everyone dismissed as fantasy was closer to a memory than a myth. 6. Why it looked empty. If all of this was real, the obvious question is, why did every expedition after Orellana's find nothing? The likely answer is one of the darkest patterns in the history of European contact with the Americas. Diseases like smallpox and measles didn't need a European explorer standing in the room to spread. They moved along existing indigenous trade networks, jumping from community to community faster than any expedition could travel on foot or by canoe. Populations with no prior exposure could lose the vast majority of their people within a generation or two, in what researchers call virgin soil epidemics. By the time later expeditions retraced Orellana's route, decades or centuries had often passed. The people were gone. Fields left untended and roads left unused don't stay visible for long in a rainforest. Tropical growth can reclaim cleared land within a human lifetime, folding earthworks, plazas, and causeways back under vines and canopy until they look, to anyone standing on the ground, like they were never there at all. The forest didn't erase this civilization, it just grew back over the grave. It was never really a pristine wilderness. It was a landscape that had been built, lost, and buried in that order, and everyone who came after mistook the burial for the beginning. A starving lieutenant who wrote down a city nobody believed existed. A theory that spent 50 years telling scientists not to bother looking. A handful of cattle ranchers who accidentally uncovered the first proof the theory was wrong. And now, lasers flying silently over the canopy, finding more than 20,000 pieces of a civilization that was never actually lost, just hidden under the one thing dense enough to hide it. Francisco de Orellana never lived to see himself vindicated. Neither did Gaspar de Carvajal. But 500 years later, the forest they floated through is finally giving up the receipts. Tell me in the comments, do you think there are entire cities still sitting under that canopy that we haven't scanned yet? And if Carvajal was right about the towns, what do you think he was right about that we still haven't found? Subscribe, because next time, we go looking somewhere just as buried, and the proof is just as new.